Thank you, Sean. Thank you for the arrangements. I wish to also express our thanks for the participants for discussing this issue and then hopefully come with the best recommendations that basically we can rely on for our members and third-party sectors that might be involved in the same issue. I wish to first introduce Mr. Henning Gramann, MD, GSR Services from Cyprus. I wish also to introduce Mr. Yunzhi, Head of Technology and Information, China Classification Society. Mr. Bruce Hailey, being the ISSA lawyer from Salvus Law. I wish also to introduce Mr. Alexander Van Julen, member of the Singapore Association of Ship Suppliers and Services. Also, Mr. Junsun, being the Subdivision of Protective Measures, Marine Environment Division, IMO. We also welcome Mr. Brian Elliott, Senior Project Officer, European Maritime Safety Agency. I think, gentlemen, this meeting could take probably 3 hours or 4 hours, but I think we can do it in 1 hour or less. We can basically debate and give our point of views, and Sean will be recording them. And then hopefully with some of your experiences, your practices, we'll probably hopefully come up with a sensible recommendation for everyone to basically follow. Thank you very much. And I really, really look forward for a successful debate and a successful webinar. Off to you, Sean.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and welcome to everybody and to the membership of ISSA. Not only to the members here who have come in live to listen to the debate, but also to the members who will be downloading and listening to the webinar online later on today, straight tomorrow, on the ISSA website. The whole issue of hazardous material has taken the industry and focused the industry's attention on this because of the implications it has as far as their areas of responsibility are concerned. This is an area of concern to ISSA and its members. We wanted to really hold this webinar to get an idea on what ship suppliers should be doing. I'll just ask Mr. President if you could just mute yourself, would that be possible? What the responsibilities would be for the ship suppliers and the industries as a whole, as far as the European rules are concerned, and also as far as the IMO MEPC 69 rules are concerned. As the President has said, we've got a very, very good, stellar panel today. And I'm just going to ask each one of them, just for over a 2 to 3 minute period, just to outline the key issues facing the industry, facing suppliers, and also the owners and managers as far as IHM is concerned. And I'm going to start with Mr. Fan from the China Classification Society. Sir, if you can unmute yourself and just give me a few words on what you feel are the key elements here. And I know that you have been working with the IMO on this subject, but over to you, sir. You'll need to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I participated in MEPC meeting, and when the IHM guidelines is developed, I participated in IMO working group. So I'm a little bit familiar with those requirements about how to develop the IHM. So I would like to share some experience with everybody. And also, before today, Mr. Saeed contacted with me and discussed with this topic already. So I already put out my key points about how to provide the information by the suppliers. And from my point of view, that the IMO and IMO's requirements and also the EU requirements, they are already described the their responsibilities about how to provide the information for different kind of products. For example, for the consumer products, from my point of view, that we don't need to provide the information detail because based on the IHM guidelines and also the same requirements from the EU guidelines. The EU they are mainly follow up the requirements developed by the by the IMO, and I think that they already described how to provide the information by the suppliers.
Okay.
Was this is just my key points of this. So if I'd like to join us to discuss more details about this topic later. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Fan. I'm going to go on to Yunzhi just to get your view here as well from the IMO perspective, if I can. If you could just over the next 2 or 3 minutes, just give us your area, your issues do you think that we need to really concentrate on?
Thank you, moderator. Thank you, Saeed. And good morning, participants. So my name is Yunzhi, Technical Officer in International Maritime Organization, and I'm dealing all the issues in IMO related to ship recycling and the MAP Annex 4 and 5. And as you know, the Hong Kong Convention seeks to provide a cradle-to-grave solution to minimize the environmental and healthy safety risks associated with ship recycling in the most effective, efficient, and sustainable way. So just update you about the latest state of the convention. As you might have been aware, to date, the Hong Kong Convention has been ratified or acceded by 15 states. The combined water fleets of these states constitute almost 30% of gross tonnage of the water fleet. And their combined ship recycling volume constitutes about 14 million gross tonnage. It is about 2.61% of gross tonnage of 40% of water fleet. So the convention requires 3% of gross tonnage of water fleet. So there's still 0.04% to go. So this is not sufficient for convention to enter in force. In particular, the convention requires one more major ship recycling country to ratify the convention. And the good news is, as you might have been aware, the government of Bangladesh has committed themselves in their Ship Recycling Act that they are working towards being compliant with the Hong Kong Convention requirements by January 2023. So those being able to accede to the convention. Therefore, we have reason to believe the convention will be very likely to enter into force in 2 years. And so IMO Ship Recycling Conference also adopted a resolution to invite member states to consider applying the technical requirements contained in the convention on a voluntary basis to ships and to ship recycling yards. And understand this also includes ship suppliers. So regarding the IMO guidelines, under the Hong Kong Convention, there are 6 sets of guidelines which have been developed and adopted to assist the member states for implementation of the Hong Kong Convention. 2 guidelines have been developed and adopted to assist the states in implementation of the convention after it enters into force, which have not yet. which covers survey, certification, and inspection of ships. So another 4 guidelines have been developed and adopted to assist the member states in the early implementation of the convention, so technical standards. So this covered inventory of hazardous material, ship recycling plan, safe and environmentally sound ship recycling, and the authorization of ship recycling facilities or yards. So resolution MEPC 26968 is the guidelines for development of inventory of hazardous material. So these guidelines provide the clarification and the interpretations and the uniform procedures for technical issues arising from the provision of the convention. The IMO resolution on IHM guidelines was adopted in 2015, inviting member states to apply the guidelines as soon as possible. So the guidelines provide the detailed requirements on how to develop the IHM, including the requirements on material declaration and the supplier's declaration of conformity. Those ensure the collection of data on hazardous materials throughout the entire shipbuilding chain. So I'm glad to see that the industry has voluntarily applied the guidelines since its adoption. In summary, from the perspective of IMO, the Hong Kong Convention has not yet entered into force, but it has encouraged the member states to consider applying the technical standards contained in the convention on a voluntary basis to ships and to ship recycling yards. So the IMO 2015 guidelines for the development of inventory hazardous material are applicable to ship owners, to ship suppliers. Although these IMO guidelines are not mandatory in application at this moment, it is mandatory upon the member states to consider these guidelines while enacting their domestic legislations, implementing the convention in their respective jurisdiction. So that's my understanding of about the convention and the guidelines. I think, from perspective of IMO. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, John, and appreciate that overview. What I think we'll be trying to get out of the webinar today is actually the implications and the responsibilities for ship suppliers in relation to the rules and regulations as well. So look forward to getting your comments on that later on as well. Brian, let me bring you in on this, if I may, certainly from the European perspective. And if you just lay out the situation as far as the EU and EMSA are concerned, as far as the responsibilities are concerned for sectors within the shipping community. But over to you, sir, for a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting us to this meeting. We were actually asked by the DG Environment in the Commission to front the view of the EU at this meeting, because we're the technical experts that supply technical support to the Commission. That's the role of the European Maritime Safety Agency. And my role in the agency is I lead the ship recycling work of the agency in supporting the Commission, which is mainly DG Environment. We have a slightly different situation than IMO in the fact that the European Ship Recycling Regulation is already in force, and it's been in force for 2 years. Okay, it mirrors the IMO, okay, more or less, except for 2 things. First of all, it's already in place, it's brought into place. And secondly, as of the end of this year, all ships entering the EU ports, be they EU flagged or otherwise, should have an inventory certificate for EU ships, or a statement of compliance for non-EU flagships after an inventory of hazardous materials containing information stipulated for Part 1 of the IHM has been completed. Now, for those who don't know what the IHM is, an IHM has 3 parts. The first part is an inventory of hazardous materials referred to in Annexes 1 and 2 of the Ship Recycling Regulation, which mirrors that of the IMO, except for the addition of 2 further chemicals or hazardous materials, and are contained in the structure or equipment of the ship. with their indication of their location and proximate quantities. Part 2 is a list of operational generated waste present on board the ship prior to recycling. And Part 3 is a list of stores present on board the ship, again completed prior to recycling the ship. So we're only focusing on Part 1 at the present time, on only those hazardous materials listed in the ship recycling regulation, and only in the structure or equipment of the ship. Now, I know a lot of your members are involved and are concerned about consumables. So we don't actually mention the word consumables in the actual ship recycling regulation at the at the present time. So in theory, you've got to be reasonable about this. So if these consumables that your members are providing form part of the equipment of the ship, then they should be included in Part 1 of the IHM. However, if they're used in their entirety in the everyday operation of the ship, then they should only be recorded in Part 3, which is only completed before the ship goes to recycling. So for an example, and we've had some discussion with your organization, the organization before, and you talked about fridges and televisions, for example. If the fridges and televisions basically had any of the materials in Annex 1 and Annex 2, and I can list them out in a second, then they would be in Part 1. Okay. However, if a chemical is containing a hazard of materials in this annex is used and regularly replaced, recycled, or disposed of after use, it would not be an integral part of the structural equipment and therefore would not need to be included in Part 1. And just to very quickly, of the IHM, sorry, very quickly, the hazardous materials are asbestos, ozone depleting substances, polychlorinated biphenyls, perfluorooctane sulfuric acid, PFOS, anti-fouling compounds and systems, and then cadmium and cadmium compounds, hexavalent chromium and hexavalent chromium compounds, lead and lead-based compounds, mercury compounds, polybromated biphenyls. So I'll put my teeth back in a minute. Polybrominated diphenyl ethers, polychlorinated naphthalines, radioactive substances, and certain short-chain chlorinated paraffins, along with brominated flame retardants. So it's a very short list. Okay, we're not talking about all hazardous materials. We're talking about only those hazardous materials containing these chemicals. Okay, and there's obviously the two that the EU have put in over and above those already in the Hong Kong Convention guidance. So that's what I have to say at the moment.
Okay, Brian, thank you. That was excellent. I'm going to, and we've got some good questions here, which I think you'll be in a good position to answer in a minute. Alex, your 3 minutes with just some concerns from your side. Please keep it to 3 minutes, Alex, and then we can then carry on with the debate.
Stick to the 3 minutes. Look, I think we obviously all want the same thing. We want to have a
Do you want to introduce yourself first a little bit?
Okay, well, my name is Alex. I'm a council member on the Singapore Association of Ship Supplies and Services. We have been trying to address this issue for quite some time already, because for the ship suppliers, this has a major impact. So I'm here to at least try to put our point on the table, and hopefully also to the people here that are representing the European Union and the IMO, and shed some light on what in reality what happens in the situation right now with the documentation. We all want the same thing. I think we want a safe environment, safe marine environment, and we also would like to protect the oceans and the water for our kids and our grandkids. So there's no question about that. The ship suppliers would like to render their assistance in the program to make whatever the IMO has stipulated and European Union has stipulated to make that come true. The reality of the whole situation is that we're not, although the program is labeled a ship-breaking program, the owners of the vessels are approaching this completely differently. During the lifespan of the vessel, administration needs to be kept on board. And there is actually a question whether or when a lifespan of a vessel is. And for many owners, the lifespan of a vessel ends the moment they sell it to somebody else. So the lifespan and the administration requirements on board the vessel does not come up the moment the vessel gets scrapped. It comes up the moment the vessel gets sold to another owner. They will ask for the same administration. You need to have a chain of administration there. So the IMO has issued regulations. The regulations as they are described in the MEPC 269 are very unclear. There is, for example, in the MEPC a regulation that says that a supplier must declare whether or not an item contains hazardous material, which basically means that every item that is being supplied on board a vessel must have the declaration, either a positive or a negative one. The ship owners don't know what to do with this. So what the ship owners do, they pass the buck downwards. And we ship suppliers are all the way at the bottom of the till. We are the guys that supply the material, and we get the documents, which is in the MEPC regulation. And I'm very happy that Mr. Brian couldn't even pronounce it properly. Well, we are ship channelists. We don't even know what it is, right? And we have to make a declaration whether the products that we are supplying contain the goods or not. And if we cannot, then the ship owner actually says, well, then I cannot buy it from you.
Okay. Carry on, Alex. Carry on. I'm going to bring in Brian in a minute on this point.
Are my 3 minutes over, or?
Well, you're on about 4.5, but carry on. Keep going.
Okay. Yeah, the other ones also went overtime, so let me go for a little while. Right now, we also have a regional problem, I would say. The regulation, the enforcement of the regulation is European. But the manufacturing of the products that ship suppliers are sending on board, manufacturing of those products may not happen in the European Union. The manufacturer is not under the obligation to manufacture under the regulations of the European Union. Only if they export to the European Union, they would have to adhere to the regulations of the European Union. That means that the vast majority of the world, and I'm talking Asia Pacific, but also North America, South America, the products that are being manufactured and distributed there not necessarily adhere to the regulations that the European Union is trying to enforce. So the items that we're supplying, if we were to go back to the manufacturer and ask them to fill up the list that we have been presented, the manufacturer will send it back to us because they don't have that information either. Now, the marine industry must understand that when manufacturers manufacture, 99% of the products that they put in the market is for consumers. The marine industry is a very, very small part of the total consumer market. So if I were to go back to my manufacturer or to my supplier and tell them, well, if you don't fill up this document, I cannot buy from you, they say, oh, I don't care. 99% of the items that you buy from or that I have are sold in the local market, not to ships. So the ship supplier has this document, he must fill up, he doesn't know how to fill it up. He must sign for it. The vessels are under legal restrictions in the European Union, with some countries actually threatening to put the captain in jail if they found something on board that is not correct. The ship supplier to fill up these documents and has to sign for it. And this, and I'll leave that a little bit up to Bruce, right, would have a legal response with it as well. So it's not about whether the theoretical a program of IMO or the European Union is correct or incorrect. We all want it to be correct, but it is just not feasible for the suppliers in the world to fill up these documents.
Alex, let me thank you very much. Before I bring in Henning and then Bruce, I'm going to get to some comments from Brian and from Yunzhi on that as well. Brian, do you want to just respond to some of the points raised there, but from Alex? It's good that it's fresh in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, we, as the EU, and under this ship recycling regulation, we're asking is basically to bring in the IMO regulations early. okay? Because we want to assume that any ships coming to the EU are aware of the hazardous materials on board, and they have a link of them. We're not basically in the process of going on board and saying that television isn't in this IHM, and therefore we're going to lock you up or fine you. The inspectors will go on board if there's an IHM on board, and there's a certificate, a hazardous inventory for EU ships, or a statement of compliance for non-EU ships from the flag, and the flag is the one that approves that, then the inspectors will be happy. Okay, they will only start looking into the IHM and basically finding out if the IHM is complete or not if there's a problem with the certificate. Okay, so it's the same, as port state control is around the world. Okay, people will go on board, look at the certification, and then go on board. It's not our role as EU or our role as inspectors to double check what the flag states are doing. So it's up to the flag states to approve whether an IHM is properly done, sampling's been properly done, it's covering all the hazardous materials, in the ship recycling regulation, or in this case, both with the Hong Kong Convention. And it's up to them to then give out that certificate. It's not for us to second guess what the flag state is approving or not. So all we're doing is taking what the IMO has done, moved it into an EU focus, because it's extremely, the issue of ship recycling within the EU is very, very, it's a very political issue, okay, and a very, very important issue for the EU. So it was the Hong Kong Convention was brought in early in order to ensure that EU vessels and vessels visiting the EU are in compliance. So we're not second guessing the flag. The flag is the one at the end of the day who approves the IHM, okay? And if they basically look at the IHM and say, well, they don't think it's complete because it hasn't got this television in, or this fridge in, or this consumable in, it's not for us to then go back and say, or second guess what they've given. So it's really the flags in, focus here.
And under the flag state responsibility there, Brian, is it down to the owner to actually supply the information? Because I think what the suppliers are saying is that that buck is being passed down to the suppliers.
Okay, well, at the end of the day, the IHM has to be completed by the owner in conjunction with an IHM company who do it. They'd start off by looking at doing a desk-based approach, looking at all the data that they've been sent by their suppliers, okay, the suppliers of the ship, and identifying where the hazardous materials are. And that's then followed up by either a random sampling or a targeting sampling methodology on the vessel. Okay, obviously, some of that hasn't been able to happen because of COVID, because the samplers can't go on board vessels, which is why we produce the European note for, if a ship comes without a complete statement of compliance or a inventory of hazardous materials, then they have to give the reason why. And if the port state control officer agrees, they've got 4 months to rectify the situation. But so, we've been asked many questions, and the thing is, it's not for us to either interpret the IMO guidelines or basically second guess what the flag states are doing. So if the flag state coming back gives a certification, then that will fulfill the ship's role when it comes to Europe.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So do you have any comments to make that you want to add in before I bring in Henning?
Or maybe Henning first. So yeah, because he's expert on IHM. Yeah, thank you.
Henning, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all. What I suggest is I will cover quite a lot of these issues and discussions in my presentation, but first I made some notes for introducing myself. So basically what I try to do is I want to work on the practical side with regards to following Hong Kong Convention and also EU ship recycling regulations, more from a practical point of view. And we have experience with a lot of suppliers. We have done more than 500 IHMs for existing ships. We have done IHMs for new builds. So, and I'm personally involved in the development of the guidelines at IMO since 2005, and I actively participated in drafting them. The outcome is not as I was hoping for, but this is, let's say, diplomatic negotiations, and there are a big number of flag states discussing one item. Nevertheless, what we see in the industry at the moment is a lot of misguidance, a wide lack of understanding on how to follow and how to understand the requirements. It's basically some sort of chaos, and it's like looking at a chicken stable where all the chickens are running around wildly and not knowing in which direction they should be heading. So, and we are seeing very severe consequences for non-compliance, and not over 1 year, not over 5 years. We talk about validity of documents until this equipment will be removed from the ship, which can be 30, 40 years. So this is something which is extremely severe, with a big gap of information throughout the supply chains. And how to tackle that, I would like to give at least some ideas. So like a general approach, some fundamental considerations for each and every individual supplier, and then as a backbone for planning the further steps which are required, and on how to efficiently implement the new requirements. But this is what I will try to cover, at least in my presentation. Waste, so subject for recycling. The legal background, as already explained, the Hong Kong Convention and the EU Ship Recycling Regulation. They both apply to all merchant ships above 500 gross tons, and of course the ship recycling facilities who take care of the recycling of these ships. According to that, the key requirements are the inventory of hazardous materials for the ships and the recycling practices of ship recyclers. What I would like to note is the EU Ship Recycling Regulation is covering not only EU flagged ships, but any EU visiting ship. Which means we talk about, there are different estimates around, between 30,000 and 35,000 vessels, which is more than 2/3 of the fleet which will be addressed by the Hong Kong Convention once it will enter into force. So we talk about the majority of the world merchant fleet. Development of IHM Part 1, hazardous materials and structure and equipment of ships. The responsibility for existing ships lies with the ship owner. And the focus is, or the development is focusing on sampling and inspection of ships, because the data at hand are not sufficient enough to really provide a good overview of the hazardous materials of concern according to the tables, as we can find them on board. So it's a task for an expert, and the ship owner may or should involve such an expert. He can also do it on his own, but we talk about a technical file with all consequences, so it should be based on proper practices and proper understanding. For new ships, and this is widely equal to IHM maintenance, even though it's the shipyard's responsibility, but the IHM there is to be based on documents from suppliers. EU SRR has included some additional sampling for checking validity and correctness of the documents from suppliers. To be honest, I doubt that this will really be applied, because it comes at extra cost. So I don't think so. This might be done for high-profile vessels by high-profile shipyards, which have to make sure that the end product, the ship, is really in compliance. So, but this is a different approach. In general, it's a paper-based exercise, which means the shipyards are depending on information from the suppliers. And the same applies to the IHM maintenance, which is the responsibility of the owners. And this is highlighted here in red. basically the owner during the maintenance has to request the material declaration and supplies declaration of conformity from his trading partner, the so-called Tier 1 supplier. And for new building yards, it's the same. It also directly interacts with the Tier 1 supplier. Once the IHM is prepared and certified, it has to be maintained by the owner, and that's subject to control. Port state control in EU ports from January 2021 onwards. We talk about a starting point in roughly 3 weeks. And by the flag state or classification society, because the certified IHM or the certificate is only valid for a maximum period of 5 years. Some classes even do an annual survey, which I think is far overdone, but at least every 5 years, the maintained IHM has to be recertified. And that is the challenge for the owner. So the owner is feeling as bad as like the suppliers, to be honest. The owner has to identify the relevant orders. And this, to be honest, is the biggest shortcoming what we see today. I talked to a supplier who said, well, an owner or his service supplier who's taking care of the owner's IHM maintenance, he gets paid for it, ask for an MD and SDOC for 2 boxes of bananas. These guys definitely have not understood their jobs, and this is really frightening and creating a lot of frustration and extra workload for all involved. Anyway, identification of the relevant orders is the key. Then the collection of documents from suppliers for these relevant orders. Tracking of the hazardous materials containing items on board and updating the IHM, including the IHM maintenance report accordingly. And finally, the owner has to make sure that he stays compliant with his IHM and he avoids penalties. Talking a little bit more about the dimensions. Suppliers receive the request for the relevant order items. As said, this is the biggest shortcoming today. If a request is sent out on the lower right-hand side, this is one of the emails which we send out to suppliers. We provide the forms. We provide a guidance document, how to fill it in, why to fill it in, what to be done in case of this or that. But the selection of relevant order items, as I said, is the key factor for the workload. Our statistics say that out of 100 order items, only 20 items are relevant. For 18 out of the 100, we receive a so-called zero MD, where the suppliers say there are none of these hazardous substances contained in the product above the threshold value. For 1 to 2% maximum, really, we receive a so-called positive MD, where the suppliers say, yes, this or that hazardous substance is contained, and that requires a follow-up on board. We see various service suppliers' approaches which leave the owners with a selection of the relevant order items, with a communication with the suppliers which are widely unprepared and need a lot of guidance. And this is completely the wrong approach from my point of view. Proper experts now are required to really guide the entire industry. Now we are at the beginning, and if we see so much misguidance and misleading information around that it's really, really frightening. So why is it so frightening? Because we need to avoid any incompliant IHMs. If incompliance means there is no IHM, whether or not it's due to COVID-19 or whatever, trying to convince port state control in EU that you have been unable as a ship owner to meet the deadline end of 2020, which is known in the industry or should have been known in the industry since 7 years, will be a challenge. Anyway, so incompliance means no IHM, or it has not been certified or recertified in time. The IHM is not reflecting the materials on board. We have seen wild copy and paste of sister ships' IHMs, and when the ships are 10 years old, there were so many changes that this copy and paste definitely is not adequate. Or the IHM is not properly maintained, or there is no procedure for maintenance. This means these are incompliances. And the penalty in France can be up to 100,000 euros or 1 year imprisonment. In UK, it's an undefined financial penalty and not all, 2 years imprisonment. And the same in Norway, up to 2 years imprisonment. This is very, very severe for the owners. And they have to make sure that maintenance is done right. Because these are the, let's say, government or enforcement penalties. But the consequences with regards to cargo owners, charterers, and so on can mean even bigger penalty. So what is the role of the supplier? He has to provide a double-packed documentation. Supplier's declaration of conformity, and this is one of the key aspects I would really want to highlight. The SDOC is a company-specific document. It is not customer-related. It is not order-related. It's a statement from the supplying company. You can use it for any of your clients. And it's a legally relevant statement which overtakes full responsibility for the related material declaration. The material declaration is a product-specific document, also not related to a specific order, to a specific ship or client, except of one item where the delivered quantity needs to be specified. This is an issue which should be reconsidered by IMO and EU really, really soon, because that creates the bureaucratic effort tremendously. Anyway, it's a product-specific document, and it contains information or a statement on presence or absence of the listed hazardous materials. And it has to be provided also when no hazardous materials are contained. The key aspect is both documents have to have a validity as long as the product exists on board. If you want to limit it to 5 years, 10 years, this is not legal. But it's quite clear that suppliers depend on information from their own supply chain. What we keep receiving are so-called asbestos-free declarations. This is not adequate on what we now need to fulfill. So what's the process? The tier 1, which means the supplier who delivers the products directly to the ship or to the owner, that's the tier 1. He receives an order and a request for the documentation. First of all, the relevance of this request should be critically evaluated, because many of those today are not justified. Anyway, if it is a justified request, tier 1 becomes a data collector because he relies on information from his tier 2 supplier. So he has to get the same information from the tier 2. And I fully understand that many tier 2s may make 0.1% of the annual turnover with the maritime industry. But there are other regulations applicable to many different industries. The key is to get hold of this information, or to inform his the tier 2 supplier that information somehow must be available, and they should only provide it in a different format. If they are not relying, or if they're not following, then they should send whatever they have, and then it can be evaluated. The biggest challenge is that you're not only creating a chain of information, you are creating a chain of liability. And as a tier 1 supplier, if you can't back up the information which you send out with your products based on tier 2 information, you are responsible. So that's one of the key aspects. So what is important is identification of the relevant orders or order items, and then to get the right documents, and then to change these documents into your own forms. Because what we keep receiving is that a tier 1 supplier straight away sends us the tier 2 documents, where we say, sorry, we are acting on behalf of the ship owner. And the ship owner does not have any contractual arrangement with the tier 2. he has it with a tier 1. We are not looking for tier 2 documents. Keep the tier 2 documents, create your own tier 1 documents, and then send it to us. Otherwise, the system does not work. Just to give you an idea about the efforts, and this applies to the MD management when we look into it for the supply industry, and the same applies to the IHM maintenance efforts. Categorization of the order item, if you have the right knowledge, takes around 7% of the time. Sending out requests, we have a software, it's not even 2%, it's 0.2%. Okay, but the review of the documents which we receive from suppliers, and sometimes we are not accepting them for 10 times and explain again and again to the supplier what mistake he has done and what he should change, this is really the majority of the workload. I know suppliers are now struggling with the first stage, with the 7% to categorize the order items. The biggest workload, sorry for the bad news, is yet to come. If it comes, the remaining 5% is converting the information which you have received from tier 2 suppliers into your own documents. What are the typical mistakes? There is no SDOC reference in the material declaration. As I said, you have to deliver a double pack. If the material declaration is not making a reference to the legally relevant statement in form of the SDOC, we can't accept it. It's a standalone document where you say, sorry, please provide us a full set. Or issuance of order-specific documents. That means you create such a huge workload for yourself as a supplier. You have to issue new docs for each and every order, client and ship. Don't do it. Using the IMO forms, even though they are referenced in the EU ship recycling regulation, there are no official forms which include the 2 additional EU substances. We have created them, and that's the key. We have to follow the same approach as provided by IMO and referenced by EU, and the right forms need to be at hand as well. If you start right from the beginning with including the EU substances or considering them, it comes at hardly any additional cost. So, because avoid a double standard, EU is more complex because of the 2 more substances, but it fully covers all IMO requirements. So implement one standard as a supplier, then you don't have to consider the flag state of that ship, whatever, and you're not running 2 sets of documents in parallel. Keep it simple, keep one set, and meet all requirements. Because in case of EU flagged vessels, the IMO forms are not acceptable. They have to have the 2 additional substances. Then what we see on the owner side, on service supplier side, and on supplier side, there is no consideration of the applicable exclusions. Here in the red framed box, keep attention to that. What we additionally do, because we have done more than 500 IHMs, we include high-risk spares and materials. We have seen a lot of ships which were built asbestos-free, but due to the supplies, asbestos has been installed on board a ship with severe consequences for the ship and the ship owner. So we have to keep the owner safe, but also the same should be done within the supply chain. And as I said, we keep receiving tier 2 documents which we can't accept. Another example, this is a certified IHM. The IHM was prepared by a very good shipyard. It was certified by one of the top classification societies. And here it's a nice combination of very common mistakes. The quantity is provided for the pure hazardous material instead of the full homogeneous material which contains the hazardous material above the threshold. It might not be so easy now to digest that. It needs to, it requires a little bit more understanding of the topic itself, but this is one of the most common mistakes which we find in IHMs for new ships, but also sometimes for existing ships. And this is where the IMO guideline for IHMs is also providing a wrong example in itself, should be corrected. And we see here a reference of the quantity, for instance. So let's say 0.96 kilograms of lead can be found in electrical cables, sheath, bearing, hydraulic motor, grease piping, contactor, and so on. How much can I find in which part? That is essential. I have no idea how the distribution of lead in this product is. I need to know which part is it. To be honest, a bearing in most cases is just metal and metal alloy, is excluded. A piping, usually, if it's not coated, same is here. And lead is not related to the coating on that. So if it's the piping or is it the coating, I don't know. And quite a few mistakes really just for this entry. To be honest, this IHM for this new build had 402 entries. We looked through, we striked out the majority of them. We ended with 87 valid entries. All the others were incorrect. And the owner went back to the class and asked what they have done. We still wait for the answer. So that is really critical when it comes to the knowledge in the industry. Conclusion. All ships, more or less all ships, need these documents, the MD and SDOC, not only those requesting them today. These are your customers. You should start with the preparations, define and maintain the processes. Who is responsible in-house? How you want to set up the communication and control and related training. Data storage and archiving. Understand that the period of use of the documents which you collect from your suppliers might vary if your suppliers change sub-suppliers, but validity is as long as the product exists on board. Inform your suppliers about your upcoming demand and provide guidance and forms. Otherwise, they are completely lost and absolutely unwilling to follow up on your request. Include MD and SDOC in your terms and conditions. Maybe you can relate it to completeness of the delivery and relate your payments to that. All of a sudden, the motivation to fill in these documents and provide them is increased a lot. So, chain of information is chain of liability. Don't create unnecessary risk for yourself. Back up all the information which you provide to your clients with information you have received from your suppliers. I hope I was not completely out of time, and thank you very much.
That's super. Right, I'm going to go over to Bruce now to get his views on all of this. And excellent presentation, Henning. Really a lot of good information there. We're starting to get questions coming in, which I'll whiz over to you all in a second. And also, if you do have questions amongst yourselves as well, if we can sort of give ourselves, say, another 10 minutes or so for the webinar. But Bruce, give me your thoughts on this, please.
Thank you, Sean. Good day, everybody. I'm Bruce Hailey, a solicitor in England. I first came to this subject when Alex addressed me on it many months ago, very concerned about how things were developing. And I've been following it closely from the supplier's side ever since. You know, my angle is most definitely from the side of the ship supplier. I haven't been addressing it, for example, from the side of the ship builder, but the regular ship chandler. And clearly there's a difficulty for the suppliers, which Alex has very eloquently set out. And Henning, thank you very much for your explanation, which I think really cuts to the real heart of the problem that suppliers are facing, which is that they are receiving requests, the very requests that you're describing, from owners that completely misunderstand the IHM requirement. And you know that is really the big problem facing ship suppliers. Now, I'd like to pick up on a couple of points that have come out of the helpful introductions. The first is that the IHM guidance, MEP 26968, I think, does give some guidelines. But when it talks about material declarations, it talks about the suppliers to the shipbuilding industry. It says at 6.1, suppliers to the shipbuilding industry should identify and declare whether or not the materials listed in Table A or Table B are present above the threshold value in the Appendix 1 of these guidelines. And Table A and Table B are the tables that set out the chemicals that I'm certainly not going to try to name. Interestingly, Table D, which is the table headed regular consumable goods potentially containing hazardous materials, and this is the table that doesn't apply in respect of Part 1, but applies in respect of Part 3, gives examples such as computers, refrigerators, printers, scanners, televisions, fluorescent lamps, chairs, sofas, pillows, towels, and many others. Those, it seems to me, are at best loosely fitted items, which appeared in the list of exclusions that Henning just put up in his very helpful presentation. So we've heard that a material declaration is necessary, and that it should say whether or not a hazardous material is or isn't present. So it's not a declaration that applies only when hazardous materials are known. It applies, one has to make a negative or a positive declaration. How then, and I'm not saying that the guidance isn't there, but I'd like to understand how one identifies when a product that doesn't contain hazardous materials has to be identified within an MDOC. When does a supplier have to say, I've supplied this product, it doesn't contain hazardous materials, but I'm giving this declaration because I'm obliged to do so? I'm struggling to understand that particular point. And again, I come back to the list of exclusions that you put up that actually I hadn't seen before. Obviously, haven't read deeply enough. But that list of exclusions clearly would rule out most of the things that ship suppliers, ship chandlers, are providing. It seems to me that the primary obligations are on shipbuilders, if it's a new ship, to establish what is in the fabric and structure of the ship, excluding loosely fitted items. And it is only the fabric and structure of the ship that requires a material declaration. And I would just, if we could come back to Henning to explain how this identification of materials is to be made, because as Henning has rightly said, absurd requests are being received by suppliers from consultants, not just from ship owners, but from their paid consultants, to provide the declarations for bananas or whatever else it might be. And we've seen your bar chart that shows that 86% of the time is engaged in dealing with an exchange of information and reviewing information. But if that process has to go on for the supply of a television, which appears to be a loosely fitted item, falling only to Part 3, then why are suppliers being asked to provide material declarations in respect to those items? I fully accept that some chandlers are asked to supply technical items that spares, let's say, that will become part of the fabric of the ship. But those spares are the same spares that are already fitted to the ship. They're already in the IHM Part 1 inventory because they're already in the ship. It's a like-for-like replacement. The owner already knows what he has. So I think that those are the issues that I have. Adding only one more, which is that and this sounds like an attack towards Henning, but actually Henning has provided, in my view, a really, really good explanation of what the true position should be. But you do point out that this is a question of liability, and that if a supplier gets it wrong, then they may be liable. And I think that's a contractual matter, not something that arises out of the regulations, because the responsibility is on the owner to comply with the regulations. And if the owner doesn't do that, then that's his responsibility. If he wants to complain that as a matter of contract his supplier has let him down, then there may be a discussion to be had between the two of them. But I don't see liability resting on a supplier under the regulations.
Brilliant, Bruce. Thank you. But Henning, do you want to just respond to those points there raised by Bruce?
May I quickly add something that Henning then also can respond to, if you don't mind?
Yep.
Okay. What the story from Henning seems to be missing is, it takes the point that the information is available. But what if the information simply is not available? Do you want the supplier to make an untruthful declaration out of not knowing what's in the item, so I sign it anyway and declare it as there's nothing there? Or you don't want the supplier to send a declaration, right? What I also quickly want to then also post, imagine you want to buy a TV, so you go to your nearest TV shop. You bring with you the IMO documentation that you have right now, the SDOC. And you say, I want to buy this TV, but here you got a document, can you please fill it up? I guarantee you none of the TV suppliers in your city or whatever can fill up this document. Then if you have that expectation, if you know that suppliers cannot give this information, why do you put the expectation on the supplier?
Henning, over to you.
Okay, there's more than a handful of questions and comments. I try to provide my views on that. First of all, the IHM maintenance is clearly to be based on the same principles like development of new build IHMs. This is the regulation 432 in the IHM guidelines. So it reads, in parts, should be updated according to the requirements for new ships as stipulated in paragraphs 142 and 144. And updating is not required if identical parts or coatings are installed or applied. So we come to the second question already. That's one of the exclusions which need to be considered carefully by the owner before sending out a request for the SDOC and MD. Nevertheless, in case of existing ship IHMs, we can only develop an overview of the hazardous materials we can find on board. We are under a tight deadline. We have very limited time on board, and my experience is the owners prefer to pay $500 for the IHM instead of 5,000. So, and anything gets certified. That's a big issue. So a certified IHM is no guarantee that the IHM is accurate. From my point of view, for the product which I provide or which I develop, which in this case is the IHM, I have to overtake responsibility. We will see a lot of interesting cases coming up in future on the initial IHM, but that's not the key point here. The thing is, and it's really, really the key, because Bruce and Alexander have brought up the TV, which is clearly excluded, first of all. What is really essential is, let's focus on the parts which are subject for material declarations. If we don't get this wrong, we will never come to a point where we say, okay, it is manageable. The first point is really identify only the relevant items. And this is, as I said in my presentation, one of the biggest shortcomings throughout the entire maritime industry today. From new builds, classification societies, suppliers, ship owners, service suppliers, all of them. So the liability issue, we have, with the principle of the material declaration, we have a self-declaration approach, as we have it in the electronics industry. The EC marking, for instance. With the EC marking, the supplier or the manufacturer makes a legally relevant statement saying, I am in compliance with the RoHS, Restriction of Hazardous Substances in Electronic Products. There is no certifying body. There is no controlling entity in between. The principle is, if somebody finds out that he has put the CE marking on his electronic product wrongly, the penalties are more severe. So this is what we need to consider here as well. So when the tier 1 supplier can't get information from the tier 2 supplier, first of all, EU SRR and Hong Kong Convention can only reach up to the direct trading partners of the maritime industry. Shipyards, tier 1 suppliers, which directly deliver to ships. They can't go further into the hinterland. The same applies to port reception facilities and so on. Widely discussed on IMO level as well. How far can we go? With recycling yards, can we go beyond the fence of the recycling facility? No, we can't. So that's a given fact, which means only tier 1 suppliers are more or less the guys which can be grabbed by the maritime industry and somehow be involved. What the tier 1 supplier is doing with the tier 2 supplier is his own decision, his risk analysis or risk assessment, what he prefers. He can sign any form without any involvement of tier 2 suppliers, without detailed knowledge. It is his risk. It is a paper-based approach, which I highly criticize, to be honest, but that's the case. So on the other side, I suggest for the tier 1 supplier to follow the same forms, the same approach as the one he has to follow when he delivers his goods to shipyards or ships in a port. He can try to get the same forms implemented. On the other side, if he has suppliers who are not delivering these declarations, he can find alternative means, which means he can get an expert involved who looks at the product and says, here and there, all fine, nothing there, there's only one material in the product. I might nibble off a little bit of it and get it analyzed. It comes at a cost, no doubt. But this is an alternative the tier 1 supplier has with his suppliers. The ship owner does not have this option. When we discussed at IMO the material declarations and IHM maintenance, I made a proposal and said, what about inspection-based material declarations in case a ship owner does not get the MD and SDOC from the suppliers? From a legal point of view, this is not practicable because the legislation says you have to collect MD and SDOC. And then the same rule can't say if you are not following the rule, you have an alternative B. So that's more like a legal problem. So even though it would solve the practical problem for proper IHM maintenance. So I'm not sure if I have covered all questions and comments, but I stay here for all questions.
Henning, sorry, Sean.
Yeah.
Could you just help a little more on how, I mean, you rightly say let's focus on the parts that do require a material declaration of conformity. How are those parts identified?
Sorry, I can't hear Bruce.
Sean, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Bruce. Yeah, can hear you. Can you hear me, Henning? Try again, Henning. Can you hear us?
Give us a wave if you can hear us, Henning.
I don't think Henning can hear us. It'd be to do with his own computer.
But maybe this question, Bruce, may also be for IMO.
Yeah, I mean, while Henning is trying to sort out his sound, Brian and Yun,
Henning can hear.
Okay, Henning, do you want to quickly answer that point from Bruce? And then I just want to finally bring in Brian and Yunzhi just to get their views as regulators here.
The question, Henning, was that you quite fairly say, let's focus on the parts that do require a material declaration of conformity. And my question is, how are those parts identified? What is the proper way to identify parts that do require a declaration, whether it be negative or positive?
Yeah. So the relevance needs to be identified based on proper understanding of the requirements, and especially applying the exclusions. That really renders whether or not this maintenance process is efficient. You can't expect proper understanding from all involved. And I hope over the time, the level of knowledge will increase, which means now it's the industry, it's the maritime industry, maybe also the legislators, but also the supply industry to look into it and to come up with one set of understanding, I would say. We are helping suppliers to argue against unjustified requests, telling them, guys, sorry, dear ship owner or whoever we talk to, this request is unjustified for the following reasons. And we see it in the hundreds and thousands. So, and that goes through the entire, let's say, supply chain. It starts with the ship owners, with shipyards for new builds as well, with somehow expert service suppliers down to the owners themselves, and then approaching the suppliers. So when we do it, for just one example, when we take care of the IHM maintenance for owners, we integrate 1 hour of support for each and every supplier. We give them guidance, not only in written form, we give them personal guidance by email, by phone, whatever, and explain to them how they can make it more efficiently. So that's because we want to increase the return of the documents from suppliers. That's our task when we take care of IHM maintenance. And at the moment, we have a backflow of around 80% to all our requests. And there are other owners who take care of it by themselves. They have 0% backflow because they are just sending out an email and says, I want to have a document. This remains unanswered. That's quite clear. So we are in the beginning, and now it's crucial that all the key stakeholders really look into the details and come up with a proper understanding so that the different parties really come on one level of knowledge and we get rid of this misinformation which we see widely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Henning. Brian, can I just bring you finally and Yunzhi in just to get your perspectives on what you've been hearing, but maybe just some pearls of wisdom from yourself as to what advice you would give to ship suppliers moving forward based on what you've been hearing today. Brian, do you want to go first?
Okay, I was waiting to see if Yunzhi wanted to go first. From the EU perspective, we don't actually stipulate or have a positive or negative list about what needs to be included in the IHM. We simply basically say that it's contained in the structure or equipment of the ship with an indication of their location and approximate quantities. And we rely purely on the IMO guidance because we didn't think it was necessary to repeat the IMO guidance. And this is a higher level sort of a piece of legislation that basically links to all the guidance and all the guidance and all the elements of the Hong Kong Convention. So we don't actually go down the line of saying, yes, this needs to be involved, have a hazardous materials and this declaration, or this doesn't. We rely purely on the IMO guidelines. I think the issue that Henning raised is that some kind of realism needs to be given, that you don't need a hazardous, hazardous declaration for bananas, for example, and they're loose anyway, so they're not going to be affixed to the ship. and some realism needs to be brought in, but at the owner level, and that's all. You know, we can't do that from a Commission's point of view because we're relying on the IMO guidelines. So,
I mean, one question we just had come in actually, Brian, is that you know, talking about a negative list, but is there a positive list? There can be sort of. That maybe the regulators.
Well, I mean, I can't say because it's not in my gift to produce a positive list. It's in the Commission's gift. But bearing in mind that, you know, sort of we haven't gone down the lines into the nitty gritty of the IHM, and we've relied on IHM guidance from the IMO, then really I think that's because, again, we're just focusing on Europe. If this is meant to be worldwide, then really need the IMO involved in that.
Okay, and what a good intro in there for Yunzhi, just to give his views on what he's been hearing this morning.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. So, and regarding the difficulties faced by ship suppliers, and also the feasibilities for them to apply the IMO regulations and the resolutions. Although I do have sympathy about their point of view, I do echo the points made by Brian and Henning. In particular, Brian mentioned that all this IHM and SDOC and the quite depends on the flex state under the recognized organization to approve, verify, and certify. So, and also the point made by Henning, and the key is identification of relevant items. So it is a matter of time. So although the IMO convention, the regulation have been adopted, 10 years ago, and the guidelines have been development and adopted and amended also 10 years ago, so 6 years ago. So, but they are not mandatory so far. So some ship owner or supplier, they're still far. But now because of the EU IHM requirements entering into force soon, so and become mandatory. So then ship owner suppliers feel a little bit panic for providing such and being compliant with these requirements. So I think this is I understand this is experience building phase. So we need some time, and you also need to find the. I understand you might need to find a real expert and the consultants company to help solve these issues. So, in summary, I think this is from perspective I understand this is the experience building phase for all the stakeholders, including ship owner, flag state, classification society, suppliers, to how to implement the Hong Kong Convention regulation, their guidelines, and the EU ship recycling regulation. So, and if based on the experience built and knowledge they gained, and member states and NGO, IGO can, if they think, they still need some amendments to the guidelines. So I think they can propose some new output and back to IMO, and we can fine tune and improve the guidelines in future, so if needed. So that's the that's my advice. At this point of time.
Thank you very much, John. Quick question from Mr. Malik, and then also Mr. Fan wants to say something as well. Mr. President.
Yes, I'll say a few words if I can on behalf of the ship suppliers worldwide. Mr. Yunzhi, these regulations have been issued by the IMO, and these regulations are actually now are representing big challenges for a large number of ship suppliers worldwide because of the demands of their customers on declarations that they are not confident or sure about what exactly they have to do an undertaking or provide a declaration for things that they are not aware of because their stores and their items are coming from different sources, from different parties, and then at the end user is asking them to be responsible for all the chain reactions that had happened in the past. What I could suggest, we as the International Ship Suppliers Association are more than ready to sit down with IMO, provided the IMO will invite the ship supply industry, the ship owners industry, the ship managers industry. Let's all sit together on a table and try and make these rules and regulations more practical and more reasonable and more justifiable for all the related shipping sectors that are involved in that ship routing and movement around the world. The maintenance, ship repair companies, the service providers that I mean, the ship owners and operators, I mean, in a small committee, whether through the associations, through the organizations that basically represent the sectors of the shipping sectors in the shipping industry. That way, the practicality point will be more clear. There is also the legal sector that can also be available. So when we pass a regulation in any maritime industry, there are a lot of sectors that are indirectly involved, which the regulators in IMO may not be actually aware of the details of how the operation of that particular service being provided is affected. So one way or another, I mean, if I can kindly request the IMO officials to instead of waiting for many years, because it could have consequences and it could have a negative impact on our industry. We represent 1,800 companies, 40 countries, but how are we going to protect our members through an IMO regulation which has already been issued and it has already been, state members have already agreed to? So maybe amendments to these regulations that could probably be more reasonable and more practical to the industries and maritime sectors so that the implications are evenly, fairly actually treated for all the members, for all the maritime sectors who are involved. So it's a proposal I would like to send out. If we can get something like that, we could probably be able to solve these differences in about a year instead of waiting for 5 years. Because waiting for countries to come back and reply on these things, I think it's going to take time. So this is my request. If that can be done, we will appreciate it. Thank you.
John, do you want to just respond to that, and then I'll bring in Mr. Fan?
Thank you, Mr. Singh. I just want to provide additional comments, both for the ship owners and also for the suppliers.
The conference call.
For MD and SDOC, this is just only required to be provided for the new buildings and also for the existing ship after they develop the IHM, and also only for the fixed equipment. For this ship, the IHM guidelines already provide the definition of the fixed. So only for those equipment, the suppliers should to provide the MD and SDOC. Also, but there is some exemption. For example, for the equipment, electronic equipment, the printed circuit boards, they contained in the electronic equipment. They, according to the IHM guidelines, they don't need to provide the MD and SDOC. And also for those defined by the IHM guidelines as loosely fitted equipment, when this equipment provided on board ships, the suppliers don't need to provide the MD and SDOC. And also for the, as we mentioned that before, for the consumer goods, they don't need to provide the MD and SDLC, and also for the but we need to carefully about this, because for the computer, for example, if the computer is designative for the ship, for example, the loading computer, then the suppliers should to provide the MD and SDLC. But for the personal computer, they don't need to provide the MD and SDLC. And also, for example, for the solid metals or metal alloys, they also, for these suppliers, they don't need to provide the MD and SDLC. And also, for those equipment that don't need to provide the MD and SDLC, but they need to provide the general information when the equipment installed on board the ship. For example, the suppliers name the quantities, but they don't need to provide the 9x9 declaration. And for how to control the accuracy of the information, I would like to suggest we could follow the IHM guidelines, because these guidelines already required that the ship owner, the shipyards, and the suppliers should to establish the control system to how to control the supply chain, and how to control the chemical or material when they produce their products, and also should to establish, for example, the quality system to control the accuracy of the information. And in practice way, I would like to suggest to, when the ship owner or supplier, the tier 1 suppliers to sign contract with suppliers or tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, they need to write something to require the second supplier to provide some information they need to when they provide the equipment. So through this supply chain, for example, for the suppliers, the tier 1 suppliers, they can collect the information for their sub-components provided by the tier 2 suppliers. And also in the future, I think that because if you read the survey and the certification guidelines developed by the IHM, by the IMO, there is a requirement related to market surveillance. This part requires that whether if the suppliers or ship owner couldn't provide the accuracy data, by the administration will check, or even they will provide some information to other, for example, to the flag state. And also in this section, they require that when the party, when the Hong Kong Convention entered in force, each party and the MO should take some national measures applying the Articles 10 and 12 of the Convention. These two articles are related to how to related to violation of the Convention, and also the detention of the ship. So in the future, maybe even for example, for the EU EU states, maybe there were some states where established some new requirements to use this section to regulate the suppliers or ship owners to control the accuracy of the data. And
all right, Mr. Fan, I'm going to probably just move on very quickly on to Jun Sun.
Okay.
But thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you.
It's a very, very comprehensive element there. Jun, just finally, because this has been a super debate. We've done over 92, 93 minutes now. So just finally, I mean, just your sort of overarching view on this, but also in response to the President's request about getting the suppliers, the owners at the table as far as amendments are concerned.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Moderator, and I also appreciate comments made by Mr. President. So, regarding his recommendation, I have 2 points. And the first is I think we also thank Mr. Fan and Henning share with their experience, because they have involved in ship recycling in the IHM more than 20 years. So my advice is that in particular in this unprecedented time, so if you have any problem, please approach your flag state and recognize organization, classification society, and also the proper experts like Henning, Mr. Fan. So I think they will give you proper advice on MD SDOC. And also, the second the comment is, if I may, so allowed to correct a little bit the policy of IMO. Actually, all the decision and the regulation and amendments are made by member states, are party driven. So IMO provide the platform for all the member states, and also IMO will be definitely be happy to welcome any proposals from stakeholders, including member states and IGO, NGO, about any recommendation, advice regarding the IHM in future. And but the key thing is that this now, based on the IMO rules of procedure, we needed the proposal for a new output, which should be submitted via the member states. So no problem for any technical discussion, but if it is related to the amendments to the regulation, to the guidelines and the revised guidelines, you need approach to your flag states, member states.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Yun. Very last word, Henning, very quickly, please, because we do probably need to wrap things up.
Thank you very much. I think the key point is really identify the items. Then otherwise you create a problem which seems far bigger than it actually is, which makes it more cumbersome to really think about it and deal with it. There are other industries which have gone through the same process. The automotive industry, of course, we talk about huge numbers and a lot of pressure from the automotive, or let's say car manufacturers. They have gone through it 25 years ago. For medicine technology, so all the medical equipment, they have gone through more than 10 years ago. They have to record each and every substance, not only a selection of 15 different hazardous substances, each and every substance. We can learn from them. I looked into it, or I keep looking into it since 2007. It's not rocket science, as it might seem to be. What we have to do is understanding the requirements and especially the exclusions. This as a starting point brings us much further than talking about TV sets. So we do this for suppliers as well, to take care of their MD management. It comes at a comparably little cost, but of course, we rely on the cooperation of tier 2 suppliers, and there are alternatives. But it's not like this job can't be done. It can be done. So, but we need to understand the scope properly before we can discuss the other details and other concerns.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Henning, and some good wise words there. I'd just like to thank all the panelists here today. The debate has been very, very good, very strong. We've had good interaction from the delegates as well. I know some of you have been answering some of the questions as well, and thank you very much for that. The debate will also, as I said, be published online on the ISSA website. And we may well, I think, draw on the services of Bruce to do a little maybe article in the Ship Supplier magazine in the next issue, just putting things into a little bit of a context and from what maybe for advice for the ISSA members. But for me, a big thank you, and I do appreciate your time. I'll hand over to the President just to say his thanks, and then we'll bring the webinar to a close. Thank you, Mr. President. Just a closing word from you. Of thanks.
Well, very simple, basically. I think this is unbelievably successful debate, webinar we had. I wish to very much thank all the participants, Mr. Sun, Mr. Brian Elliott, Henning, Alexander, Mr. Fan, and Mr. Bruce Hailey. I think we had a very beneficial discussion. There are more than 40 other participants, 43 other participants on the other side of this webinar, listening to us, sending questions, and I think we have got everybody's attention. So that's a really good thing and a good successful convention we had. We will think about what would be the best way for us to go and take the next step forward of how we can handle this on behalf of the International Ship Suppliers Association. Once again, thank you very much and wish you all a fantastic day. Thank you.